skillforkids.com. At skillforkids.com.
Welcome to skillforkids.com. We have another video tutorial for you. Today's topic is biomechanics, technique and skill in coaching and sport. And this is part one. So there will be a part two. Now part one is going to cover a lot more of the theory side of things for this topic. And part two will deal with a lot more of the actual coaching and sports development kind of program outcomes. So I suppose what part two will be, how can we take this information and then learn how we can actually implement it to make our kids perform better in their skill-based sports. So in particular today, it's going to be really related to skill-based sports. And things will change a little bit if it's not necessarily a skill-based sport, but we'll go over that as we go along. So we can see this little triangle here. Skill, biomechanics, and technique. I've got skill with the circle around it because that's ultimately what we want to get better. So we'll go through the definitions exactly of what biomechanics, technique, and skill are, and then we'll come back to this. So starting with biomechanics. So biomechanics is the field that applies the laws of mechanics and physics to human performance. Now, we talk a lot about biomechanics in sports development, and there's quite a lot of investment in biomechanics. And I think it's more important, that investment, in some sports than others. So biomechanics is effectively the things we can measure about human performance. Things like momentum, speed, velocity, the summation of forces between different body parts. All right, that type of things. Now, there's other video tutorials on Skill for Kids and coming up on Skill for Kids that will deal with biomechanics and what we really need to know about biomechanics in relation to sport. So we're not going to go over biomechanics as a field in heaps of depth, but we need to understand probably some simple stuff about it. So we'll use the golf example as our first example. So just think of someone, a beautiful golfer, a lovely, big, long, fluent, smooth swing. It all times together really nicely and they hit that ball a mile. All right? That's an example of body parts working together really smoothly, body parts working together to generate club head speed. All right? And we could really study the elements of that swing, and we obviously do, and study the swings or shots and stuff across various sports. All right, so that's our biomechanics. Let's deal with technique. So technique is the manner in which a task is performed or the series of movements to perform a task. All right, so if we come back to technique and put it most simply, it's what we see. All right, so if we're looking at the golfer from before, it's actually what we see and how they look, their own kind of style. And technique, as biomechanics is, it's obviously really important. So let's think about baseball in this time. Someone who is just, beautiful, smooth swing. When they connect, they hit the ball a mile, and kind of people will look at it and go, oh, that's just, that's a lovely smooth swing. So now let's move on to skill. Now skill is the proficiency or ability to perform a task as a result of training or experience. All right, so it's the actual, how good is someone at it? So in terms of breaking that down into the parts of it, we have perception. Now perception, or in this case visual perception, is the understanding of what we see, and in terms of sport specific stuff, how quickly can we judge ball flight, spin, speed, etc. The decision, all right, so what are we actually going to perform? So based on what we're seeing, are we going to adjust our swing in a certain way? Are we going to try and hit it hard? Are we going to block it? What are we going to do? And motor action, which is actually what we end up doing. So you can see it's actually quite a bit more complex. And you can see this end part, the motor action, is actually just the end part. So if we come back to biomechanics and technique, they more just form only part of the motor action, which is only part of a skill. Let's think of a cricketer, for example. So a cricketer is facing a bowler who is playing slower balls, throwing some kind of leg cutters in there, some faster balls, some bounces, really mixing up. The bowler's really mixing it up. And that batter, because they're skillful, not only they may have great technique and be able to play a beautiful stroke, but because they're skillful, they can read the different balls that are coming. They can adjust, they can make decisions on what's appropriate, and then they can actually execute the task, the actual task as well. So you can see the difference between biomechanics, technique, and skill. All right? Now, if we come back to this part, skill is sitting at the top. Now, none of these things are separate. Of course, if you're biomechanically more efficient, it's going to allow you to be more skillful. If you're biomechanically, you can generally move your body in more biomechanically efficient ways, it'll help you be more technically sound. Just the same, if you're more technically sound, it'll help you have greater biomechanical efficiency in our motor tasks. If we're more skillful or generally more coordinated, it will allow kids, or adults even, to then probably acquire and learn better technique. All right, so these are really, really related, but at the end of the day, as coaches, all we're really worried about is this. Now, we know that being good in these two areas will help this, but that's what we've really got to worry about. So my question a little bit is that how much time do we spend on this, and how much of a good understanding do we have on this stuff compared to this stuff is what we're ultimately worrying about as coaches or as administrators that are trying to set up the most efficient sports development programs. All right, so the skill is what we're really, really worried about. We're in skill-based sports, we're worried about how good someone perceives, the good decisions that they can make, and then adapting successful motor actions to this part, to what's actually happening. Now, I will break there for 1 second and just go back to golf. And it depends, for something like golf, this part is important in terms of perceiving the environment and being able, with hand-eye coordination, but there's no time pressure. So this part, we could say it's not quite as important. So it's a little bit different for different sports, and that's obviously why we go about, helping kids and athletes learn differently in different sports. All right, but it's still, this biomechanics skill technique is all very relevant for every sport, but this part can change quite a bit. Okay, so we've gone over a little bit of base information. What's biomechanics, what's technique, what's skill, and that skill's what we're really worried about. So now we're going to go over and actually have a look at the brain. And you may have already started to realise that you're getting the feeling that it's my belief that we probably spend a little bit too much time, energy, effort, and investment in biomechanics because we can measure it, and people love to be able to measure stuff, but some things we can't measure, but that just because we can't measure them doesn't mean they're hugely important, or just because we can't measure it yet doesn't mean we should, invest more money in other things or time and money in other things just because we can measure them. All right? We can't measure skill quite as well, all right? But we are getting better at doing that. And technique, as coaches, you're probably going to tell, it's going to be my opinion, that possibly we spend a lot of time trying to develop this technique that looks really nice and, because we as coaches, we can see it and we can see the result that we're getting very quickly with changes of technique, all right? But there's implications for that from a learning point of view. Spending a lot of time on technique and lots of explicit information can affect skill. So, but in saying that, getting good technique at a young age will help someone be more skillful. So, overall, you're probably going to tell that we're really worried about that and we're just using these to help us. But our greatest investment in time and energy has to be here. Now, we're going to deal with some brain basics, as I said. So we've got the brain 101. Our brain controls everything we do. All right? In sport, we see stuff. That information comes into the brain, our brain tries to make sense of it very, very quickly, and in time pressure sports, say, like cricket or baseball, that has to happen so very, very quickly. So we understand it, and then our brain delivers impulses to muscles to perform motor actions. And in between there, after the understanding of the visual information, we've effectively made a decision. So, let's go and have a look at what makes up the brain. And hang with me for a second here, because this basic stuff here will help us explain things a lot more later. A neuron. Neurons are brain cells. That brain is made up of billions and billions and billions of brain cells. Neurons connect to one another through synapses. Neurons have dendrites that receive, these little connections that receive receive impulses, and they have axons, this blue one here, that delivers impulses. Axons come off one cell, connect to a dendrite of another one. And that connection there forms a synapse. Now, when we're developing and learning, effectively as coaches, when we're trying to get someone to become more skillful, improve their technique, we're trying to affect the way their brain is structured. So as they learn, there will be physical changes to the brain. Actual physical changes to the brain. All right? In terms of more connections being laid down, connections changing, and hopefully, if we're doing a really good job, connections, being laid down in the right direction, to the right cells, and we're talking about this is happening over billions and billions of connections as well. Okay, so synapses form as a result of the experiences we're having. Pathways eventually are developed. So pathways are series of synapses. So lots and lots of connections happening to one another, or cells to one another. Eventually we get brain pathways. So for example, if I play golf, I have motor pathways in my brain that fire off, that helps me execute my swing. All right, and that pathway is going to be individual to me based on the experiences that I've had in my life in golf, which is not a lot and not that great, but my swing is individual to me, just as anyone else's swing is individual to them in any sport. And the last thing that we're going to deal with is myelination. So we've got neurons, synapses, pathways, and myelination. And myelination, myelin is actually a protein. And what actually happens is that the myelin coats an axon. That's an axon coming off our neuron, as we spoke about before. So the more and more we play or practice or become skillful at something, the more myelin is coating the axons that are delivering the impulses to other cells and communicating. So for example, if I am playing golf and I'm a 10-year-old and I'm practicing my golf swing, over and over and over again and becoming more efficient at it, then the axons that are delivering the information off the brain cells, the neurons, are being covered in myelin. And what actually happens is that the impulses travel along the axons to the synapse, to the connections, a lot quicker. It propagates along the actual here. So those electrical signals get there quicker. So for example, a baseballer, all right, they throw that ball at however many miles per hour, a professional, and then that professional can then quickly adjust, execute a swing, and it all happens very, very quickly. And one of the reasons for that is that all the connections that are involved in that process will be heavily coated in myelin. So that's a really important kind of thing to understand about brain development practice. Okay, so that's the brain, but that doesn't actually then give us a much better understanding of skill, biomechanics, and technique. So let's put some of that together with some of this. We can have a crystal ball and have a little bit of a think about, well, what would someone's brain, what allows someone to be biomechanically efficient from a brain perspective? What allows them to be technically sound from a brain perspective? And what allows them to be skillful from a brain perspective? So I'm going to use an example here, a really good example, and this example really highlights the difference between biomechanics, technique, and skill. And the example is I was at a national tennis tournament, and it was a 16 and under nationals, and there was a young boy there who was obviously a massive fan of Roger Federer, the great player Roger Federer. And he'd obviously watched him play a lot and then gone and practiced to play like Roger Federer a huge amount. Because his swings, his shots, his forehand, his backhand, everything about this kid looked like Roger Federer when he was playing in terms of his strokes. All right, so Roger Federer is obviously technically very sound, he's great. Now biomechanically he's very sound as well, obviously. But this kid, unfortunately, he didn't hit it in that as much as some of the other kids. All right, so he didn't have an ability to read the oncoming ball and adapt his swings. The swings always tended to look the same. There wasn't the adjustments that you'd see in swing shapes and preparation that you'd see with Roger Federer. He didn't make very good decisions about, for example, when to hit the down the line or when to hit cross court or when to rally, when to hit hard. But the delivery of the motor action, it wasn't adaptable. So he'd kind of have the same length swing, have the same type of swing for every type of ball. Now in the sport of tennis, the ball's coming at you fast, slow, wide, you're half volleying, you're hitting the ball on the drop. So he didn't have that ability to alter his motor actions very well for the different types of ball that was coming. But he had great technique. Great technique. He looked, if you're just in the warm-up where the ball was coming, you know, nice, same speed, same kind of height, he looked fantastic. All right, so that's an example of great technique, but it doesn't necessarily translate to skill. So before we spoke about good technique opens up, obviously helps someone, gives them more of an opportunity for skill, to have great skill, but nowhere, it's very different, and technique is only a small part of the motor action. There's so much more we actually need to try and consider and develop. So, we then consider Roger Federer, you know, and we'll talk about biomechanics here. So with biomechanics in tennis, for example, things being nice and smooth in your strokes and a smooth build-up of racket head speed, so there's no loss of energy along the way is important. All the body, legs, trunk, shoulders, arm, all working together and firing off at the right times to build energy through the body or summate the forces to eventually have great racket head speed. So there's lots of biomechanical efficiencies there, and this kid had great biomechanics, all right, because he could actually generate quite a lot of racket head speed. So he was biomechanically pretty efficient. He was technically very sound, but he wasn't skillful. So he could have spent a long time, and he's obviously spent a long time working on his technique to try and copy Roger Federer. But he obviously hasn't spent anywhere near time enough in terms of developing the skill. So developing good technique is very different to developing good skill. So when we hit part 2 of this presentation, we can talk about the difference in terms of the developmental approach to skill and technique, or biomechanical efficiency, technique and skill. So let's actually take our brain stuff that we did before and put that into what we were seeing before. So this young kid, let's start with technique, had great technique. So the part of the brain, and usually this part of the brain delivers a lot of the motor actions, that part of the brain obviously had a series of connections that would deliver impulses that would help just perform that motor action. Okay, but it would have been probably quite simple in terms of there would have been, you know, let's really simplify it, cell connected to cell, connected to cell, connected to cell. But there wouldn't have been anywhere near as the different viable options for those impulses to be sent in terms of connections everywhere. And we call that brain complexity, as what Roger Federer would have had, obviously. So if you look down here, now this is a big simplification, but it works well to actually explain it. Roger Federer here, lots of cells connected all in different ways, so that if that ball comes fast, he can shorten off the swing and absorb the pace of it. All right? So the impulses can change. But then the ball's slow, and he has to lengthen the swing, he's got more time, use the legs more to generate pace, then the impulses will go in a different direction. Whereas the boy we spoke about before, and obviously he's a lot younger and he's had lots of development to go, but he wouldn't have had the same level or as many viable options for the motor skill to be adapted. And that's just the motor part of the brain. Because remember before we spoke about perception, decision, motor action. So now we can deal with the parts of the brain that receive and understand visual information, then connecting to the parts that are sending out the signals to make the decision, connected to the parts of the brain that deliver the adaptable motor actions. So in someone who's very, very skillful, the different parts of the brain are very, very well connected to one another and communicate far more effectively than what someone who just has great technique. The different areas of the brain are far more well connected. So someone who's skillful, we can see here, different connections from different parts of the brain integrating a lot more. Whereas that level of integration between the different parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that receive, understand visual information, make decisions, adapt the motor skills, it's not all as well connected. And that's why they're less capable or less proficient to perform a task. And how skillful they get will depend on the training and experiences they've had. And we spoke just briefly about possibly that young boy had more time just working on technique, but needed a lot more time at having experiences that would help deliver skill. So in our example, we've delved a lot into technique and skill. Let's have a little bit of a think about biomechanics. So for someone to be biomechanically efficient, it usually involves being able to coordinate the body, store energy in one part of the body, deliver it to the other part of the body, and kind of have fluency, if you like. So if we imagine our brain, for someone to deliver biomechanically sound motor actions, effectively what we're saying is that the motor part of the brain, all right, the part that delivers the impulses that deliver to the muscle that then allow for the skill to be performed, will be capable of delivering it in the right sequence. So the impulses are sent in the right sequence. So from legs firing off, then very quickly after the muscles and around the hips and trunk fire off into the shoulder, into the arm. And that would be the same for many sports like say a baseball strike or a golf swing or a tennis stroke that we've been speaking about. Okay, so that's what we'd actually see in biomechanics, and obviously if someone's very, very efficient, there'd be great myelination in the parts of the brain that are delivering those impulses, so it all happens very quickly and it all happens in sequence. All right, but once again, that's just a motor action. It's not dealing with any of the other stuff in terms of perception, decision, and motor action. So in wrapping up a little bit of part one, that gives us a fair bit of theory in terms of what biomechanics are, what technique is, what skill is, how they interrelate. A little bit, an overview of, in very simple terms, of how the brain develops, but then how someone's brain would be developing and how it would be functioning in terms of delivering biomechanical efficiency, technical efficiency, skill efficiency. So, if we can keep this information in mind, when we then actually start thinking about, well, what experiences we need to deliver biomechanical efficiency, technical efficiency, but most important, for someone to be skillful. And at the end of the day, like we said before, that is going to be the overarching aim of any sports development or any coaching program, is to make skill. So I hope you've enjoyed biomechanics, technique and skill in coaching and sport part one. Look out for part two. And don't forget, you can find heaps more information on all this type of stuff, theoretical side of things, and lots on practical coaching outcomes and practical skill learning experience outcomes on skillforkids.com. So take the time to look around the site. There's heaps to learn, and if at any time you want to give us feedback or you want to suggest some topics that you want some more information on, don't hesitate.
skillforkids.com